Salimos de otro evento más masivo esta mañana que hubo en la Cámara de la Construcción, pero queríamos aprovecharnos en realidad de la buena voluntad de los invitados para tener un encuentro más cercano aquí en un sitio como en la universidad, y poder conversar eventualmente, poder compartir más sobre estos temas. La verdad es que son dos invitados que es un tremendo privilegio tenerlos aquí. Will Lichtig es el abogado que desarrolló el primer contrato colaborativo de líderes de líderes en Estados Unidos. Recibió el premio a la innovación de la Asociación de Abogados de Estados Unidos. Ha aparecido en las portadas de muchas revistas por el logro que eso significó. Y también ha sido reconocido por la Academia Nacional de Construcción de Estados Unidos como un contribuyente al desarrollo de la industria. Ambos han estado en el directorio del Lincoln Construction Institute de Estados Unidos también. Entonces son personas que han contribuido muchísimo al avance de la industria. Will Lichtig tiene toda una trayectoria también, él es ingeniero, Will es abogado, ¿cierto? Como mandante en empresas privadas y en empresas públicas. Entonces es muy interesante su experiencia desde la mirada del mandante, del que contrata. Y él ha logrado hacer esto exitosamente, con muy buenos resultados en empresas privadas y en empresas públicas. A mí una de las cosas que no me he encontrado interesante ha sido precisamente su labor en empresas públicas, donde siempre se piensa que esto no se puede hacer. Y él ha demostrado que sí se puede hacer. Y lo interesante es que quienes están aquí, sobre todo que vienen de empresas públicas, les puedan preguntar cómo lo hacen. Y tengamos esa oportunidad de conversar, bienvenido, ¿no? De conversar y de hacer conversar las inquietudes que ustedes tengan sobre este tema. También Bill ha sido premiado y ha conseguido ser reconocido por el Lincoln Construction Institute como una de las personas innovadoras en la industria. O sea, son dos personas súper galardonadas en estos temas. Así es que yo les agradezco realmente el privilegio de tenerlos aquí. La idea es que yo les pedí que hicieran una presentación, cada uno mostrando un poco su experiencia, que nos ilustre cómo han abordado estos temas en cada una de sus realidades, y que después tengamos un tiempo para conversar y para poder resolver dudas que ustedes tengan, de manera de que la idea es que esto podamos empezar a promoverlo en nuestro país. Se ha demostrado que hoy día ya existe suficiente evidencia empírica de que el trabajar de forma colaborativa trae ganancias para toda la industria. O sea, para el mandante, para el contratista, para todos los participantes. Entonces estamos perdiendo una oportunidad tremenda en no de verdad tomarnos en serio esta forma de trabajar. Así que, sin más, les voy a dejar con tu parte. You will start?
Well, sure, why not?
Okay.
Thank you. So I understand about this much Spanish. So I do know that Luis described me as being a lawyer, and I'd like to say I'm a lawyer by training, but an innovator by birth. And so I've been out of the law practice now for 15 years because I learned so much about lean construction. I decided I didn't want to just stay as a lawyer. I wanted to go to work for a company that was taking the ideas and implementing it. So for the last 15 years, I've left my lawyering behind and really focused on project delivery. So what you're going to see now, it's just a very tip of the iceberg. I mean, we were in a seminar yesterday and we presented all day, and we still didn't present everything about how you actually integrate teams and use lean construction to deliver projects. So what we hope to do is just give you an overview and then spend most of the time answering your questions and talking with you about where you see these ideas adding value in Chile and how we've challenged and been overcome by problems in the United States and elsewhere, and how that might help you think about how to overcome the inevitable obstacles that are associated with transformational change. So there I am when I was a young man. This is when we began the effort back in the early 2000s. Sutter Health is who I started this work with. I helped them really develop in the United States what is integrated project delivery, and then again I wrote the first integrated form of agreement, the first IPD contract in the United States. And then again had a very large healthcare project that $1 billion plus US back 15 years ago, so it was a very large project back then. That was delivered using these ideas, and it was extraordinarily successful, and I think really created a lot more momentum around the IPD movement in the United States. So why did we begin thinking about using lean in IPD? Construction productivity has continued to decline. The red line is construction productivity in the United States, and you can see that since 1970, in the last 50 years, it's actually declined by 40%, while manufacturing, which is the blue line, has actually doubled in productivity. So we've not only not kept up with manufacturing, but we've actually degraded in terms of productivity in labor productivity in construction. The Construction Industry Institute did a study and concluded that 57% of the hours and dollars that were spent on design and construction are actually non-value added. That the actual value that is put in place, like this building, are only about 40% of the total dollars spent to get this building put in place. And in the United States, construction continues to be too dangerous. 1,400 workers are injured on a job site every day in the United States, injured to the extent that it's a recordable incident that has to be reported to the safety, OSHA, the safety administrators in the United States. And 4 individuals are killed every day on projects in the United States. And of those 4, 2 do not speak English as their native language. So if you look at some of the statistics, and I'll show you some, Bill will show you some others, that studies have been done that said that 92% of owners are dissatisfied with the work that's actually produced by architects. 98% of mega projects actually have cost overruns of at least 30%. 3/4 of mega projects have time overruns of at least, schedule overruns of at least 40% of the schedule. And of the materials that are brought onto a construction site, 40% of those almost end up in the landfill. So McKinsey did a study a number of years ago and really looked at the areas that we could focus on, and this was after we'd actually begun the IPD efforts, but it largely coincided with many of the things that we were saying, that if we focus on these things, we believe that we can improve the outcomes on our projects. So I'd like you to take a minute and just think about a project that has failed. Maybe it's 2 months late, it's 20% over budget, and the injury rate was twice as high as a typical project. So why was that? What are the things that contribute to the kind of statistics that we have seen? So just think about that for a minute. Because again, what we believe is that we can begin to identify the things that really contribute to these types of project outcomes. So the way we traditionally have structured jobs is what we call the why, the what, and the how. The client who is deciding why do they need to build something at all. Either what's the business need, what's the social need that needs to be met, and they develop some form of business case that suggests that if they were to be able to go out and solve this problem, it would benefit whatever their interests are, whether it's a business interest or a social interest. And so then once they get approval of that idea, then they often go out and hire an architect or engineer to begin describing the what. What do we need to build in order to provide that service or that benefit to society? And then those ideas are usually captured in a set of construction documents or issued for construction documents, and then we go out and we bid or we tender to get the constructors, the folks that understand how that actually is going to get built, to try to decide how are we going to build that within the amount of money that our estimators say we can do it in, and within the schedule that our managers say that we can do it in. So there's a silo or a segregation between the why, the what, and the how. We call this the curve of common understanding. So we often have, again, the owner and the design professional hired early. Maybe some consultants are brought on board. Maybe a constructor is brought on board to provide early consulting services. But the folks that are actually going to build the job don't get involved in typically until after the construction documents are permitted and issued for construction. And so then we begin this steep climb while the people who actually have to build the work try to understand what is represented in the construction documents. And those documents are often incomplete. They're great for permitting, but not so great for building. And so we begin the process of asking questions back or forth to try to understand what really needs to be done in order to build the job. And you'll see that even at the end, we often don't get to 100%. Oftentimes even the customer is at the building and grand opening and they'll say, huh, this isn't exactly what I expected. And often there are claims at the end of the job because the constructor thought that something wasn't shown in the documents, but the owner believes that it was. So again, we often don't ever get to 100% common understanding. And then we have deep silos in the organizations between the design team is typically walled off from the owner team, and then they're also walled off from the constructor team, and there's not a lot of very good connection and conversation that is occurring among the different providers who actually really should be working together to deliver the capital asset. And like we talk to our kids, at least in the United States, we talk about playing a game of telephone, where you have a bunch of kids standing in a line and you start by whispering in the ear of one kid a statement, and then they pass it along and whisper in the ear of each other. And by the time it gets to the one in the last, it sounds like something totally different than you whispered in the first kid's ear. That's the way we try to manage the flow of information on construction projects. So on a healthcare project, Bill does primarily healthcare projects, you may have a contractor who has a question, and it may be that physician who has the answer. What does the temperature need to be in the operating room, and how are we going to control for that temperature for a particular type of surgery? Well, we've set up a mechanism to try to get questions to the person who needs to know that follows this very complicated path to get to that person, and then the information comes back again in this kind of game of telephone, and often when it gets back to the person who asked the question, they sort of look at you like, well, that is an interesting statement, but it doesn't really answer the question. And so you go through this over and over again. There was a study in the United States done that said that every RFI that is issued on a project costs the project about $5,000 to process. That's at a minimum of the time that's spent by all the people along the chain. And so on projects, it's not uncommon to have 1,000 RFIs, 2,000 RFIs. So a significant amount of money is spent just on managing the flow of information. So the idea that we've come to is that one of the primary challenges is that there's a lack of common understanding among the project participants as to the why, the what, and the how. And so we need to find a better way to express that. Let's see whether the audio works with this. I'll put it, I didn't know it wouldn't play through here, so let me
already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are 2 people stuck on an escalator and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something? I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm gonna cry.
Well, there's nothing else left to do. That's it.
Hello? Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second.
He said he can fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. Who says he can fix it?
So again, in some ways, there are just some of us that 20 years ago said we just need to get off the escalator. So we asked our questions, the question basically, are we helpless victims of fate? Or are there things that we can do in the way that we manage the delivery of capital assets that could fundamentally shift the outcomes that you've seen produced by the traditional methods? So we began with this idea that risk on projects is largely, I'll call it a self-inflicted wound. So when you thought about the things that cause a project to go bad, I will suggest that most of those, doesn't mean that there aren't act of God or rock where you expected there to be sand. Those things happen, but most of the poor project outcomes are driven by the way we manage design and construction. So we believe that you can implement systems that focus on developing uniform purpose in the team and a common understanding among all performers throughout design and construction, and that will begin to remedy the problems we've experienced before. So this is really just an overview of what we consider to be lean project delivery. There are 3 areas that we believe have to be addressed. We sometimes call this the 3 domains of project delivery. Organization is how we bring teams together, how those teams are governed, how you manage and self-regulate the team. The operating system is the way that you actually do the work of design and construction. And we called it the operating system when we started because 25 years ago, 20 years ago, it was like you had the Macintosh operating system and you had the Windows operating system, and they were fundamentally different, and you couldn't really blend them. You either were going to have an Apple or you were going to have a PC. And then the commercial terms, and we'll both talk a little bit about the commercial terms, but the IFOA really focuses the team on how do we share risk and rewards so that the way we want to behave and the way that we want, the methods we want to use are actually reinforced by the way people are allocated risk and reward for participating in the project. Now when we started at Sutter Health, we started with a 2-page manifesto that was called the 5 Big Ideas. And it was just, we didn't really know what lean project delivery was going to be at that point. We just knew that we were going to invent it with the owner and its supply chain partners. So we started with this idea of increased relatedness. What we mean by that is that on projects, people often come together as strangers, and they often leave as enemies because of their experience in delivering the project. And what we believed is we needed to create durable relationships, durable personal relationships between the people that were delivering these projects. What we wanted at the end of the job is for people to leave as friends and to treat each other as colleagues, not as adversaries. So we focused on how do you create more personal connections between the people that are delivering the work. Collaborate, really collaborate. Well, when we started this, people would say, well, I do collaborate. I take the design that I've developed and I give it to the constructor to do a constructability review. And then they give me some ideas on how I can make it less bad for them, and some of them I accept and some of them I don't. And the idea was that's not collaboration. Collaboration is coming together to solve the problem, not to react to a solution, but actually to study what are we trying to achieve, what do each of us think we can add to thinking through the problem, and often coming up with a solution that neither of them independently would have come up with. Projects being networks of commitment. It's a privilege to be able to talk about this one in Chile because this really was introduced by Fernando Flores. The idea that projects are basically a promise, and that the way work gets done is people making and keeping promises. And that's not the way traditionally projects are thought of. It's usually think about people being assigned tasks and executing tasks. So there's a lot of focus in the projects that we work on about the workflow loop that Flores developed, and people making and securing reliable promises for executing the work. Optimize the whole, sometimes we call that optimize the project, not the piece. Again, over the course of 50 years in design and construction, things have become more and more specialized. And we take each of those little specialized pieces and we hand it off to somebody who's a supposed expert. And they often will optimize for their little piece of the project. But often when you aggregate all those little pieces at a system level, it doesn't really work very well. So part of what we're trying to do is have the project view in mind and making sure that we're always looking to optimize the whole, not the piece. And then tightly couple learning with action. Oftentimes, again, people would say, well, we get to the end of these 2, 3, 5-year projects and we do lessons learned. And then we put those into our lessons learned books that nobody actually looks at. But we are doing that at the end of our jobs. And we said, no, we need to do this on a routine basis. At the end of every meeting, can we do something to improve the meeting? At the end of every week, can we look at our performance and ask ourselves, can we do something better or different? How do we pause and do what we call retrospectives every 6 weeks or so, where we actually have a meeting that's only focused on looking back at the last segment of work and asking what's working and what's not working. What should we keep doing? What should we stop doing? And what should we start doing? So you begin to have continuous learning happening in projects, continuous improvement. So again, those are the 5 big ideas, or sort of the cornerstones of this idea of integrated project delivery, the place where we started. So what does the transition look like? In the old, the organization was hierarchical, it was siloed, and it was typically command and control. The operating system was largely focused on CPM and the way that that was developed to manage projects, this idea of specialists and a focus on the parts, and that commercial was often in the United States lump sum and low bid, low price. That's how you got the job, was that you came up with the low price, at least on bid day. Because that wasn't the final price, it was just the price on bid day. And then IPD, again, the focus is on being collaborative, it's being flat in the way the organization is structured. We'll show you some visuals that represent how we think about that. And the decision making at the core group, and we'll look at what a core group is, they're managing by consensus. They're actually making decisions, owner, designer, and constructor, by consensus based on what's in the best interest of the project. The operating system is lean, it's sustainable, it is looking at the impact on the planet, and it's largely supported by BIM and VDC. And then the commercial system is entrepreneurial, where we're all trying, all for one, one for all, really trying to achieve the objectives of the client. It's collective, so we understand that the way I'm going to succeed is by all of us succeeding, and if all of us don't succeed, I won't, so that it creates mutual interest and a symmetry between effort, and that selection is often by best value. It doesn't mean that price and cost are irrelevant, but it means it's not the final driver or the only driver of selection. So in terms of the organization, what does this begin to look like? So we looked at this as the siloed traditional management method. We actually bring those groups together. The why, the what, and the how are brought together at the outset of the project. What Bill and I will talk about again, how you begin to bring these people in early in the job and maintain that throughout the life of the job so that you get the benefit of what the client is trying to achieve, the engineer or architect describing ways that that might be solved, but the constructor providing influence on those design solutions to assure that it's easy to build, safe to build, cost efficient to build. Instead of this hierarchical, stratified, siloed system, we go to a flat organization. At the heart of that group is the core group. Core group is typically represented by the lead designer, the lead constructor, and the owner stakeholder and the owner representative. So often in owner organizations, there is both a project management staff that the owner, like Bill's staff is the owner's project management staff, but there's also typically a business leader. And so oftentimes we want that business leader, so the voice of the business or the voice of the school, whatever it is involved, not just the project management staff. And then around that, what we've tried to do is flatten out the organization and pair people up. So if you have a structural engineer, pair that person up with the structural contractor. So one of the realizations that we came to was, beginning with the Industrial Revolution, before the Industrial Revolution, you had the master builder. And the master builder both was able to design, but was also able to execute. But with the Industrial Revolution, it caused the need for capital to buy machinery to support construction. And so that caused the splitting of the designers and the makers. That's really where you have the formation of this, the design industry and the construction industry traces its roots back to the Industrial Revolution. And so how do we get the makers, the people that are going to do the work, paired up with those who are going to design it? Because any good architect or engineer, they want to design a constructible solution. They just don't have the experience and the know-how of what it really takes to build it. So how can we bring the two of them together throughout the process? So that's the idea of flattening this organization and almost engaging in paired programming as you move forward between the people with the build know-how and the people with the design know-how. So in the operating system, again, we begin with something we call target value delivery. This is the traditional level of common understanding. Often the owner, the engineer, or architect is hired. Those consultants are born, and we talked about that you climb this slow curve. The idea in lean project delivery, target value delivery, is that you bring all those people together at the outset and you do what we call project validation. And the project validation phase is really answering the question, can we as a team develop a solution that we can design and construct to meet the owner's business need within the amount of money that the owner says they can afford to spend and with the amount of time that they say is necessary to put the capital asset into service. So that's what's happening in that validation phase. We climb that steep curve as we are learning from each other what the basis of estimate and basis of design will be. And then we're maintaining that high level as we continue to detail out and design based on the initial estimate what will ultimately be delivered and then execute the job. So again, target value delivery, this is just a quick summary of it, but again, we begin by understanding owner value. You can see at the heart is to maximize value and minimize waste. That we want to validate the owner's business case, as we talked about. And then we want to design to a target price that is less than the owner's allowable cost. The reason we set a target cost is, remember back, we looked at there was 57% waste in the construction industry. So what we're doing is we're setting a target below what we've done in the past to try to drive innovation and improvement ideas so that we can continue to improve and begin to reshape that red line that showed productivity declining 40%. How do we begin to bend that curve so that we begin to replicate what's been achieved in manufacturing? There's no reason we shouldn't be able to achieve 2 times improvement in productivity, but not if we continue to do things the way we have. And then again, this idea of designing for optimal production, again, to increase that productivity by designing the work in a way that makes it easy and efficient to build. So again, this is just highlights of the way we do that. We typically will co-locate meaning we'll bring everybody to work in one office together, the owner, the architect, the engineers, and the constructors, all in one space. We'll create a big room environment where they can go in and have meetings similar to this meeting room here, where you can bring everybody in to have big meetings and talk about whatever the issues are. Oftentimes, the nature of the work that's being done is actually posted on the walls of the big room in the co-location space. So it makes the work very transparent, and people can actually write on the things that they see and offer ideas for improvement of the ideas as they're maturing. So again, it's really a very different way, rather than people designing in their office and sharing it once a month or once a quarter. It's like, it's real-time transparency. So again, the idea is to create one mind between the designers and the constructors. And how do you share enough information? How do you look at the estimator and the constructor as being, I'll say, the consumer of the information that the design team is developing? What do they need to know in order to assure that the project is trending as it's being designed to hit that target price? So it's a very different way of thinking of who's the customer of design, because typically people think it's either the owner, the clients, that's the customer of design, or the people that will issue the permits. But the only reason we develop the design is for the people who have to bring the vision to life to actually execute the job. So it's a very different way of thinking of who is the customer of the design effort. We form multidisciplinary teams to look at these issues. They're sometimes called innovation teams or cluster groups. But the idea is, again, these are people that come from both the engineering, the owner, and from the constructor side, that have the discipline expertise to work through what the designs are for that particular system. And then we have those team leaders at the heart to bring things back so that we don't get optimization only of the piece. We have a structure in place to make sure that they bring those ideas back and that they're circulated with other team members so that we can look for ripple effects in the way that might move forward. So a classic example of that is the skin of the building is being designed. That's going to have an implication for the heat load in the building, which means the mechanical systems are going to be implicated, which then means the electrical systems are going to be implicated. So again, we have to have a way that we don't just have the people designing the envelope operating in a silo. We have to make sure that we understand what the implications are across the systems in the building. So again, then we have to look at the production management system. Again, the company I work for has been implementing lean production management, I'm embarrassed to say now, for 27 years. We began it in the late 1990s. But what we've learned is that at the heart of lean production management is, we'll look at it in a minute here, the last planner system. It's really looking at the effort to design and execute a production system rather than just schedule the work. And what we've learned is that in order for the crews in the field to get things done reliably, the work has to be made ready for them. So there are many of the things that will defeat the ability of people in the field to execute their work that are not failings of the people in the field, it's failings of people in the office getting the work ready for them. They don't have all the information they need. They don't have the materials that they need. They don't have the right labor or the right skills or the right methods to actually accomplish that. I mean, we still have jobs where the equipment that is there to do the job today, they will figure out a way to make it work, but it's actually not the equipment that they would prefer. So how do we make sure that those constraints are managed to provide the labor that's in the field the maximum opportunity to be productive, to not go looking for stuff? The other thing we've learned is that you have to help them understand how to build quality in. Typically they will build something and then an inspector will come and look at it and decide did it meet the expectations or not, and oftentimes the work will have a correction notice associated. We try to move that effort upstream with the actual field crews so that they know what is the installation manual for this work. We actually often develop like manuals like you would have if you bought packaged furniture and you brought it home, whether it's from IKEA or somebody else. It's like, where's the IKEA manual for how this work needs to be executed? The plans and specifications don't give you that. They just show you what it's supposed to look like when it's finished. How do we create installation manuals for our workers so that they're able to execute the work that way in the field? But what we've also learned is that the system won't be perfect, and so we need to have a problem-solving system. So when a problem does arise, and there is a problem in the field, there's a way to swarm the problem and both fix the problem, but then also look at the process and say, how did this problem slip through the process? How do we fix the process and improve the process so we don't repeat that problem again? And then again, the last planner system, which we often refer to as 5 connected conversations. Beyond master scheduling, where you're figuring out what should we do, then you see this part here, which is the make work ready planning, which really is that constraint identification and removal, so that we take what should be done and make sure that it can be done. Then we go down to the weekly work planning, and you can see that the focus there is on promising, again, bringing the language action model in directly to field. We find that when laborers stand up, literally we do this once a week and sometimes daily, depending on the nature of the job, they make a public commitment to their colleagues in the room. I will have that work done by Friday. We find that they take actually more responsibility for assuring that that work gets done by Friday, rather than if the boss tells them, get this done by Friday, and you'll also often hear things like, I'll try, I'll do my best, but you don't hear, I will. You don't hear the promise. So we really focus on people making reliable promises and making sure that they have what they need to pull that off in the week. And otherwise to say, no, I can't get all that done. I can only get 80% of that done, and then tailor the commitment to what can actually be achieved. And then, again, this focus on learning, we measure how well we have done and ask, to the extent that we didn't get everything done we committed, why? And what can we do differently next week to try to improve that plan percent complete, the PPC, that you see here. So then just an overview of the commercial terms, and again, Bill will talk a little bit about this as well. We're really trying to move to a much more balanced approach to the sharing of risk and reward on projects. We want to, whether it's by full IFOA or whether it's by some other mechanism that's attached to the contracts, set a risk sharing program and incentive plan in place that helps achieve the objectives of aligning the commercial interests of all parties. So it does create an all-for-one, one-for-all environment. That it promotes behavior in accordance with the project goals. We don't want to reward bad behavior, so how do we make sure that the way the commercial system works aligns with that? It optimizes the project, optimizes the whole, not the piece. Collective risk management, what we mean by this is we bring the team together to assess risk, to identify how do we minimize, mitigate, ensure, whatever the approach is to the risks, we want to take a collective approach to that. Flexibility to address changing circumstances and unintended consequences. We know that the world will not unfold exactly the way that we plan, and so how do we put a system in place that's nimble as it reacts to change? Incentivizing non-cost-based performance. So again, it's not just being cost savings that matters. Oftentimes safety is one of the things that we'll measure in an incentive program. First-time quality is often something we'll measure in an incentive program, because what you measure gets managed, and so how do we reinforce what we think is important on the job? And then provide frequent and timely evaluation. We try to create feedback loops so that, again, we can ask ourselves, are we winning or losing? And if we're not succeeding, if we're not on a trajectory to win, what might we need to change in order to make that happen? So this, again, is a very simplified graphic. I think Bill will talk a little bit about this as well. The idea is that at some point we set a target price for the job. Different teams, different methods set that at a different moment in time, but you will set a target price. The target cost includes the direct costs of what it will take to execute the work, the indirect costs both in the field and in the home office. So we believe that, again, the fixed overhead of the home office should be included as a cost of the work. And then the contingency, or the risk-based estimate, if you will. Bill actually banished the words contingency in the work that he does, because oftentimes people didn't think about why they were establishing it. They didn't think about what risks they were trying to potentially mitigate with that money. They just would take a percentage, apply it to the estimate, and say, okay, that's the contingency. Oh, and by the way, we know that that will be spent. And Bill was like adamant that isn't going to happen, so you're not going to call it contingency. But the idea is, again, that you set the target cost, you have your profit. We typically will start that as a percentage, convert it to a lump sum amount, and aggregate that among the different members so that it's a profit pool. And then again, if we are able to complete the job at a price that's less than target cost, the actual costs are less, then we have a savings, and we have a way of sharing those savings with the project participants. Some of it will go back to the client, some of it will go to the team and be distributed. If the actual costs exceed the target cost and come into the profit band, the team will actually fund that out of their profit, so it'll cause their profit to reduce until at some point, if they were really unfortunate, and it's very rare to see a job like this, the profit was exhausted and the actual cost of the work exceeded the target price, then the owner would own the responsibility for paying for those cost overruns, but would only pay for that as direct costs. There would be no increase in overhead, and there would be no increase in profit for the team. And I can tell you, as a constructor, we are not in the business of working for costs. We actually, technically that's a loss for us. If we have people that are out working and all we're getting is our cost reimbursed, it's not a very good scenario. So it really is, I'll say, a lose-lose scenario when you have that kind of cost overrun. Some people think, oh, well, the constructor's getting paid its cost, that means that they're being made whole. And I can tell you that's not the way we manage ourselves. We would go out of business if we just worked at cost. So again, the whole idea behind this is to create an environment, to create methods, to create a commercial system that really prime us for this all for one, one for all mentality. And then to answer the question, does this actually work and what some of the outcomes are, I'll turn it over to Bill.
Are there any questions, or do you want to wait?
I'll wait. We can wait and tackle them together. Those big arrows?
Tell you which way you're going.
Yeah. And one at the top is your green pointer.
Okay. After speaking for a couple of days together, he thinks he can make fun of me.
No. I'm being helpful.
All right, so just to share a little bit about my background, I've been an owner's representative the majority of my career, almost the entirety of my career, actually employed by the owners. The majority of my work has been healthcare and hospital buildings across the entirety of the United States. And so I've put somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 billion worth of work into place over my career. At about 45 years old, I was ready to leave the industry. I said, this is too hard, this is too much anxiety, there has to be a better way to do that. And over the last couple of days, I'm starting to feel that from some of you and some of your industry partners, that you're approaching that stage where, wow, we just got to do something different. This is just too hard. Now, I'm not going to tell you for a second that doing this kind of work is easier, but is clearly less stressful and less challenging, at least in the emotional and physical sense. But it is still challenging in the intellectual sense and the personal relationship sense. So we're taking, many of us went to school, a technical school, to be able to solve technical problems, but we find we end up facing human problems and fighting and arguing much more so than using those skills that we thought we developed. A very interesting book of how big things get done. The other folks we're talking to these past couple of days are talking about mega projects. Mega projects are defined as $1 billion or higher and have all kinds of complications, but two of my projects were over $1 billion. The other 1,000 projects I've done were all well under, either under that or well under that. So these processes work across the entire spectrum of project size. There are some efficiencies or inability to train on certain projects if they're small, less overhead capability. So projects of size, very similar to the statistics that Will showed earlier, 1/2% of those projects are successful based on 3 metrics of time, cost, and delivering on the owner's beneficial needs. That's a pretty abysmal record. This research that was done indicated, these are a couple of the key takeaways from that research, that projects rely heavily on collective expertise. So each individual specialist, we can't let them do things on their own. Even if they're the specialist, they need to make it collective. Forming teams focused on realizing project goals. So if you picture in your mind all the squares that Will showed on a couple of previous slides that were siloed, each one of those has their own goal. Each contractor wants to make their profit, and in many respects don't care about any other box on that screen as to whether they're successful or not. So we have to make the goals project-based, not individually based. Shared identity and purpose aligns diverse participants. Again, the common goals have to be defined, well-defined, usually to the benefit of the owner, but if the owner takes the perspective that only my goals matter, that's not a collaboration. So the owner has to care equally about the success of the other individuals and teams, or participants on the team, or this is not going to be successful. That is a mind shift, significant mind shift for the owner. It's easier for the owner to demand and walk away and say, no, you must. That's not at all what we're talking about, and that's what gets you these kind of results, not the kind of results that we would really like to see. And then the objectives need to be defined as part of the individual, as opposed to the individual's goals. So a number of years ago, we organized a group of what we call serial builders. Serial meaning we build to expand our businesses, and so building is part of our business growth plans. I specifically was working with Disney at the time. We brought all of these folks. I'm sure you recognize some of these labels, if not all of these labels. Most of them are international companies. To share and discuss, how do we make this better? So this is probably going on close to 15 years ago. In which you'll also notice that they're all different market sectors. So there's healthcare, there's toothpaste, there's chemicals, there's gasoline, there's automotives, pharmaceuticals, a couple of pharmaceuticals actually. What are the common struggles that we face in this industry? So here they are. Our supply chains, right? We all have to rely on our supply chains to get our projects done. So the number one thing is, how do we get competence in our supply chain? And I think a good bit of this speaks to the charts that Will showed of when do the supply chains get involved. So think of the supply chains as the trade partners, not just the people who supply widgets, but those are the supply chain of the buyers who need those kind of work. So how do we educate those folks? And the key answer to that is we get them involved earlier so they understand the purpose and the desire and the methodologies of putting this program together. We don't allow our partners to innovate specifically, and so we're trying to use the lean processes and again the mind shift appropriate for that in order to educate and teach people to get better. Simply say, let's get better every day. How do we focus on cost reduction, predictability? Owners start with a business case. If I can build this for $1, I'll earn a penny 100 times over every day, and so I have a business case that I need to meet, and as those business objectives, or the business case, the cost of the program goes up, the business case goes down. And so these are all very common amongst all of those industries that we saw. In fact, roughly 70% of the challenges are the same, regardless of what market sector you're building in. We do recognize that each market sector has some unique requirements that are not necessarily achievable with the same as these 70%, but still are recognized. So this is called the McLeamy curve. You may have heard of it. An architect who had studied project development some time ago. This line indicates basically the cost impact or the ability to make change during the phase of a project. So at the beginning of a project, there's very little cost to make changes and to study different ideas and think through things. Primarily because there's not a whole host of 1,000 people involved in the project already, and there's not a lot of activity going on, costly activity going on, but a fair amount of ideation goes on here. So this is really the time to ideate what it is we want to build and how do we want to build it. And then this is the cost of the work as the project progresses through the phases, the gestation process of the program. This curve represents the traditional development curve that Will showed, indicating that when do we get the actual doers, the builders involved in the project. You can see that we're nearly at the point where the cost of change outpaces the ability to change, and so we don't want to change. But now we've introduced all the people who actually have to do the work, and we don't actually know whether it's truly attainable or not. And this is really why we see so many change orders. This design didn't really help these folks put the thing together, so that cost continues to creep up. If you go back to the statistics that we showed you about from a success perspective, that's why you see the costs of the job just tends to grow as the timeline matures. So the concept here is, let's take this learning and embed it earlier in the process so that this learning can influence the design, so that when we get to the final tender, the final procurement of the program, it is far more implementable at our predictable level of need. So I spent about 7 years developing these lean and integrated project delivery methodologies across the U.S. on healthcare projects, and was asked then to come and make that transformation in a new company, and this is the Disney company. So when I started at Disney, they had basically, instead of taking a sort of slow learning process on developing projects, they said, we're going to take a deep dive. And so Disney started 3 major projects, 2 of which were over $1 billion, and said, we're going to do things completely different, and went to the new contract, the integrated form of agreement, which is a behavioral-based contract as opposed to a transactional-based contract. So they set up these teams and said, we're all going to behave differently. Big mistake. Big mistake. So by changing the behavior, we mean collaborating, working together, not leaving your project management skills at the door when you show up for the project. Many of these teams were built without the appropriate training and education and frankly leadership that says, no, let's take those skills and bring them together in an environment where we care about each other and want to work together. So those were the behaviors that were going to change, not all behaviors, so please be careful of that. So this is one of those projects. I was brought on board right about here, and the project was 10% or about $60 million over budget. So we took a step back and said, so here's, let me explain these curves. This curve is what we call a current working estimate. So in the IFOA world, as Will described, you have a target cost. So you're estimating the cost to complete the job continuously. From the day you start the development, the day that the owner gives a business case, to the end of the program. At the end of the program, the measurements that Will showed about does profit exist or not, based on how much money we spent against what we estimated that project to be. So we track them all along. Every couple of weeks we post these so that people can understand our current trajectory towards completion. And do we need to change our behaviors, change our processes in order to get to that finish line in a favorable way? So in this particular project, this was the target cost. As you can see, we didn't quite meet that target cost. We ended up a couple of $1 million over that target cost, but by virtue of changing practices and behaviors and mental attitudes, we reduced that $60 million variance to a couple of $1 million. So pretty significant improvement. Not quite the improvement we see on other jobs, but at the end of the, on most of our IPD projects, but at the end of the day, a good outcome compared to where we were when we were early in the project. These are 4 other projects that were developed at Disney. They started a little bit later, so I was there to be able to train and teach some of these processes and ideas and concepts before they got too far down the line. In fact, I educated them on how to pick the appropriate partners. It's important that you get people with the right mindset and the ability to collaborate, and the willingness to collaborate, or you're likely to end up with either the same or potentially even worse outcomes. So we went through a different kind of partner selection process, bringing the teams together, all along educating them on the tools and the strategies and the different kind of change that they're going to need in order to develop that. So again, this is the current working estimate on each of these projects. At Disney, they would carry a contingency on every project on the order of 25% of their anticipated cost of the project. That was based on their historical outcomes. They may still, in many of their projects, they still would overspend that contingency and continue to spend. In fact, they had this term called the money cannon, that at the end of a project, so for them, schedule was non-negotiable. We were not going to miss a schedule no matter what. And so that no matter what oftentimes turns into overtime and extra expenditures and all that. So at the end of a program, they said we shoot the money cannon to get the project finished. Now, unfortunately, that's not very fiscally sound, but as you know, Disney is very successful, so they continue to do things the way they've done them because they're still very successful. A little secret, after the CEO of Disney comes out and congratulates everybody and introduces the new project to the community, the customers, the visitors, he immediately takes the project team into the back room and gives them what for about not delivering the project based on the goals. So
that's not the happiest place.
That's not the public facing is the happiest place on earth. The behind the scenes facing is not the happiest place on earth. So we did then start to develop programs that were far more successful. I will tell you, there's always naysayers, no matter what. So you present this to a group of individuals, and they will say, well, this was a hard project, these were all easy projects. These were projects with unknowns, these were projects with knowns. So there's always going to be naysayers, no matter what you do. We did 16 projects, 15 of them came in under budget. It still was all those reasons why we were able to do that. So you have to have a thick skin, saying, okay, well, we know we did much better than historically done. We returned contingencies, we shared profits with our partners, we trained our partners in doing things differently for the success of the future. So go ahead and criticize all you want, but we felt like we did some pretty yeoman's work there on 16 projects. We did learn some things. We want these IPD projects to be an environment of continuous learning. That is a true tenet of Lean. And so we asked ourselves, what did we do? In this particular slide, I lined them under Shingo's concepts of easier, better, faster, cheaper. I try primarily to focus, well, this is the order in which Shingo says to approach those kinds of things. So I tend to believe that the cheaper works itself out in the end. If you can accommodate these 3 things, the cheaper is going to work itself out. And I think that's evident in these curves. So now, once again, I've been given the privilege of trying to transform a 3rd organization. In fact, this was sort of by choice. I took my learnings in the private sector. Many people will tell you that the private sector, you have all kinds of latitude because you don't respond to governmental requirements. You're spending private money versus public money. So I was given the opportunity to go to a healthcare system that is in the public sector. They're owned by the county of the state of Florida. And so personally, I wanted to take on the challenge. I would come to presentations like this, and inevitably, every time I would get somebody to stand up during the question phase and say, well, yeah, that works in the private sector, but what about the public sector? And unfortunately, my answer had to be, well, I don't know. I've never worked in the public sector. I don't understand the challenges of the public sector. So I was given the opportunity to learn about the challenges in the public sector. And I will tell you, they are real, and they are different than what the private sector is capable of doing. However, I believe I proved that these concepts still work equally in the public sector, and I'll show you here in just a minute why. So I was brought in to a $1.5 billion program. We're an 8-hospital system across just the county, so just a region of about 5 million people, and we support the health care of all 5 million people regardless of their ability to pay. So we are what's called a safety net healthcare system. And so we try to operate at a margin. If we can make a couple of $1 million a year, we're doing pretty well. And that basically funds our maintenance and our upkeep, but it doesn't fund our growth, our capital restoration programs. So we were granted $850 million of public money, which is tax money. And then we earned another roughly $800 million during the time of the program, during about the 7 years of the program, to fund and grow that program in its entirety. This particular chart I'm showing you, hopefully you're beginning to recognize this curve. I have seen this curve on over 100 projects. And if you were to step back a little bit, you'll see that they're very common. They start off with the business plan here. They grow through what some people call the hump of despair, where people tend to say, oh my gosh, our estimates are outpacing our targets significantly. Well, this is really what I have come to learn as the period of discovery. Right? When someone says, build me a new hospital, well, what does that really mean? Right? And so it takes a period of time and development and collaboration to discover the details of what that's going to be, which then, of course, drive the cost estimates of what that's going to take. And it's almost always additive because you don't truly understand the entirety of the delivered requirements. But by the time you get to a certain point in a program, sort of like mid-design development, where everybody is starting to really understand what the outcomes need to be of this program, and there's a shift to innovation. We ask for, we demand, we teach, we train, we drive innovation throughout these projects. We allow those trade partners who have come on early to understand the needs of the program. We allow them to offer ideas and thoughts and come up with great ideas of how to do that. And then we see the project costs start to decrease. This is roughly about the time when construction begins. So we've climbed that curve of common knowledge that Will presented. People understand the program. We've innovated through the sort of some of the best practices of each of the individual trades, and they've worked together with all the other trades to determine how their work can best be applied together. And then we go to work. We go to work through then a lot of the measurements and the creative processes and the last planner system that Will briefly spoke about that still works together with the individuals in the field, the foremen all working on and controlling their own work, trying to again bring the costs down. So we are, in this particular graph, we are shooting for this target line when we started. We added scope to the work, so the owners learned from the build team that we could do, perhaps in this instance, we built a shell floor for future beds that we didn't need that day, but at the time, the cost of that shell floor was pretty de minimis compared to the total investment. So the owner decided to bring more money to the table to get more benefit for the future. So we altered our target cost and brought it up to here. we did ultimately hit a couple of bumps in the road. Has anyone ever done a project that some unexpected occurrence didn't happen? So they still happen. However, the team now has developed their innovative capabilities, their collaborative problem-solving techniques, and are able then to bring those costs back down. This particular project ended at $162 million with the $170 million target cost. So the team was allowed to share in that, and about $4 million of that savings. So they all walked away with an increased profitability, and the owner got some money back in their pocket to solve other problems on other projects that were necessary. Now this is all in the confines of the public sector contract that I was held accountable for when I walked into this program. The contracts, in fact, were already signed by the participants. And so I had to manipulate the methodologies that are traditionally done in the public sector. So what we did here was we hired the construction manager at risk immediately after hiring the design team, immediately after hiring the architects, and required them, I know you can't read these, but these are bi-weekly increments. So every 2 weeks, the contractor and the design teams are working together to estimate the project. So we call that continuous estimating. It's not quite continuous, it's really rapid iterative estimating, but it is really live. You're watching what's happening live, so you can make value-based decisions. A good value-based decision right here. We then, once we started the development, we went out for what we call design assist trades. So we hired 7 major trades: mechanical, electrical, plumbing, civil, structural trades, and brought them in at the design process here through a design assist guaranteed maximum price. I can give you all the details of that if you want, but all of these were previously used tools that the county, the government would allow us to use. But I brought in the learnings of the innovation and the collaboration that I had learned from my private sector work. Okay, so by this time I'm really excited. Wow, these things are really working and we're making some headway. Now I was doing six projects, all of which were at least 100 million or more concurrently. They were all in the same phase. And so here's another one. Now that curve may look very familiar to you, although it doesn't look like the curves we've been showing you so far this morning. So this is really what I call fake lean. So again, lean is a mindset, right? It's a mindset of continuous improvement and waste elimination. When we bring it into the construction environment is where that collaboration and breaking down those barriers really starts to differentiate it a little bit from a manufacturing process perspective. So you're asking a bunch of individually contracted organizations to behave differently. And so what's very common, or at least my common experience, is when I stand up in the room and I'm a senior executive from the owner's organization, and you are all my business partners for this endeavor, and if I say you're going to do this, right, what are you going to do? You're going to nod your head like this, right? You're going to say, yes, we understand that's what you want, that's what we're going to do. Until you go back to your office. And then you behave the way you want to behave. And so that's what happened on this project. And so you can see that there's just absolutely no predictability here. There's no understanding of where the program is going. You can see we thought we were finally, we started with a target cost here at $250 million. We learned that we were nowhere near that, so we got to this point where we couldn't move the needle for several months. And so the organization said, well, okay, I guess we got to take our bad medicine, and we increased the budget by about $25 million. And said, okay, here's your new budget. But the behavior didn't change, and the project ended up at $325 million. So $50 million above our revised budget, $75 million above our original budget. So team was resistant to any and all the changes. You can see another team, so it's not regionally, right? It's right there. The project was less than 10 miles away from each other. The team completely abandoned the efforts to work collaboratively. I will admit that the owner did change the plan a couple of times. which is, honestly, I hate to say, it's pretty common. You know, based on the duration of these developments, they might go 5 years. In the nature of healthcare, it's very dynamic in any given community. And so you might say, well, we really believe now that we're closer to the opening that we need more surgical capacity or more imaging capacity or something. And so we struggled a little bit with the indecision, which is why we were willing to increase the budget at this particular point. And those scope changes caused some of that heartache and discontent. So we really realized that we just didn't take the proper time to deal with the people and the culture, and I'm encouraging you to consider that strongly. People, you have to, when you're selecting partners, one of the key things I focus on is, are you willing to try to learn? Are you willing to admit that you don't know? If you don't admit, if you're not willing to admit you don't know, you're absolutely not willing to try to learn. So when I interview for partners, those are some of the key questions that I use. You need to learn, you need to adapt, you need to want to learn, and you write all of that stuff into your request for proposals as you're seeking partners. So the grading scale, if you will, for partner selection has changed dynamically. I have 6 or 7 basically emotionally intelligent related topics that I will measure a participant in as opposed to some of their technical skills and those abilities. Are you willing to learn? Are you willing to change? Are you willing to adapt? So to not leave the speech here with all gloom and doom, here's another project that was going on at the same time. So one of the rights we do have as owners is to change our minds. Now, when we change our minds, it's very critical relative to the outcomes. Again, we're now at about year 4 into what was anticipated to be a 10-year development that actually finished in 7. But we're at about year 4. We're probably in the neighborhood of 90% committed to all the programs we're going to do, all the money we have to spend. And we had a significant increase in our organ transplant program. And so we said we need more intensive care beds on it. All organ transplant patients are intensive care patients for a period of time. So we need more intensive care patients if we want to continue to grow this program. So how do we develop that? Well, it turns out we had some opportunity for vertical expansion on top of an existing building. And so I asked the organization if you were willing to consider shifting money to do that. So they said, sure, let's study that. So I brought the team together and said, let's study that. We said, okay, we can build what amount, I call it a 5-story building. It's really 3 stories on one side, 2 stories on the other side. And it's going to cost $115 million. We assessed the remaining funds to our program and our ability to fund that. We said, oh no, we can't do that. The maximum amount of money we can come up with is $77 million. So they said to me, well, what can you give me for that? So I cut the building in half, and I said, I'm going to give you 3 stories on this side, and I can't build beds on one of those floors, but I can give you 55 intensive care beds for $77 million. So I had a team come together who understood our needs and was able to innovate there, to validate this in about a 2-month period. So we were moving pretty rapidly. We developed the budget at $77 million. And here again, you can see the same curve that I showed you from the Disney experiences and the many others. We go through the discovery process and said, oh, I didn't think about that, I didn't think about that, I didn't think about that. We studied a number of options, and then we were able to innovate the program. You still learn, if you've done a vertical expansion, they're pretty tricky. And then do the systems infrastructure below, are they sufficient to handle all the systems that you're going to put up above? And so there was a bit more discovery going on here, but we ultimately made it to the finish line with the anticipated program budget. We did add a few things, as owners are wont to do. Oh, well, can we take care of this or take care of that while we're at it? So the owner benefited even though they kept the price the same. And so we considered that a pretty significant win. We did change the contract to a more traditional contract. The contractor was reticent to continue the risk process. We had done, I think we've done a tremendous value engineering process here. true value engineering, which means we can make value-based decisions along the way. I tend to think that that may be, if not the, it may be one, it's certainly one of the most valuable outcomes from this process for an owner, is they can make decisions with real-time cost analysis and a high level of confidence that what people are telling them things are going to cost is what they're actually going to cost, because the people telling you that are the ones who are going to do it. So you can make high reliable decisions. And you can go back to your organization and say, well, here's an opportunity for us if you're willing to fund more, so you don't miss some of those opportunities that you might otherwise not been able to take advantage of. So I think, again, from an owner's perspective, that is a huge value add to this process. Decisions to stick to, if you're representing the owner here in the room, this is critical, right? You have to force your operators, the people who are going to use the building, to make decisions and not change their minds, or these costs are going to go like that previous graph showed. I'm sorry, but it is the responsibility of that owner's representative to scold even their bosses at times. Lest we talk about the owner of the whole presentation here, I want to show you what this means to the partners. So this particular project had an anticipated
Just a second. Just read.
profit of it had an anticipated profit of $4 million when the team was ready to start building. I felt as the owner that, hey, you were supposed to build me a helipad, but you missed it. You didn't include it in the drawings, you didn't include it in your price. Maybe I wasn't emphatic enough during the development time, so before you can enhance your profit, you have to build me a helipad. Now you get your profit, but before you earn extra, you got to build me that helipad. So this gray bar right here represents the cost of that helipad. So the $4 million line is the profit that they all anticipated when the project started. Day one, when you do your risk analysis and your estimates, and you've not necessarily even procured the entirety of the program, the estimates were they were going to earn, approximately $1.5 million when they had anticipated earning $4 million. Along the way, they learned some things and consumed approximately another $500,000 of that profit, and it stayed that way for a while. So this is probably, and I don't recall exactly, but this is probably the structural assembly of the program. So they're coming up out of the ground, they're building up the structure, they're not doing a lot of work, productivity type work, with all the interior fit outs, the plumbing, the mechanical, the electrical. So those estimates stayed consistent for a period of time. And then they started that work and started to recognize some efficiencies. And so every 2 weeks we would come together as a business team and say, where are your estimates versus your actual productivities, and what does that look like financially? And they would whittle away at their estimates and say, okay, I don't need that much estimate, so it's going to convert to profit. Once again, as a misbehaving owner, I said, well, the market has changed, I need to add an open heart program to this program. Can we do that? So for a few weeks, the team assessed that and said, yes, we can, but you need to give us more money. Okay, I get that. I'm asking for more. I should pay more. And so that's what this little step function represents. Is we did that. They still didn't anticipate any improved profit until they really got the hang of things. Now we're really in the deep throes of productivity, and they're starting to find ways to work together to reduce their estimates, which then contributes back to their profit. I made one more change. Sorry. But again, brought the money to the table. I didn't force it down anybody's throat or anything else. So at this point, we measured the $4 million. Now at this point, I show up on the project, and it's a couple of weeks shy, 3 weeks shy of, this is in California, so they have high inspection requirements and all kind of stuff. I walk in the room, and the project management team, the 4 senior leaders on the team are playing ping pong at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm like, whoa, dudes, what's going on here? And so really what that means is they had so much confidence in the success of this project that they were comfortable enough to enjoy a game at the end of their workday. And they were comrades, right? And so they were having fun. They were having fun on a construction project weeks before turnover. Outstanding. I basically, after that, I turned around and left. I said, you guys don't need me anymore. You did a great job. So the end of the story is, during contract negotiations, I said, I have to limit your profit to 150% of what you anticipated. Why? So think about your CFO. What do you mean you're going to give away money? What are you going to give bonuses for? What are you doing all that for? And so to protect all of the distrust in certain offices, that if you're going to share leftover money, well, obviously you're going to bloat the estimates, right? So that there's money left at the end of the job. So I put a ceiling at the amount of enhanced profit that could be made, and the ceiling was calculated at 50% of the profit. And they did, in fact, exceed that, which allowed me to spend some money to enhance the program a little bit further. So, and actually, this last little notch here is $1.5 million worth of, I'll call it, free work. It wasn't free, but it was money that was saved sufficient to pay for that work. What's your story? Thank you.
Bueno, ahora las preguntas.
I have a question. Sorry, my English is a little bit rusty, so be patient with me. I apologize in advance. I just have this main concern related to that. How, as a lawyer, can we provide better or the best legal advice for this kind of project?
So my question is, why is it always the lawyer that asks the first question?
So let me also explain how we came to this agreement, because it's actually pretty interesting. So Sutter started its effort, and as we started the effort, we picked a number of pilot projects to work on. And we were working on those projects, and what we did initially is we brought, this is a long answer, but we brought together 225 people from our vendor community for 3 days of training about what is lean project delivery. We brought them together, and then I think it was every 3 months, we held a meeting where we invited them all to come back together and talk about what are we learning, what are the challenges we're experiencing, and what do we need to do differently as we work together to try to achieve better results. And so when Sutter began the effort, we were using our traditional contracts. And in one of the early vendor meetings, one of the mechanical engineers stood up in the room and said, "You're asking us to behave differently, you're asking us to do our work differently, but your contracts still require us to do things the way they've always been done. They allocate risk the same way. Would you be willing to consider changing the contract?" And the Bill Seed of that organization looked at me and said, "Would we be willing to change our contract?" And I said, "Sure." So we actually went off, and for 6 months we studied how to come up with a new form of agreement. And then developed it, and then put it into effect about a year after we actually began the Sutter effort. And we used it first on a couple of small projects, and then the first large project we used that on was that project that I showed you, that Van Ness and Geary project that was over $1 billion. So, from a lawyer's perspective, again, you have to decide whether you really can contract away risk. And I say that part of my personal journey and why I got involved in the lean movement is because I had spent 25 years as a construction lawyer, and I had concluded that lawyers lived off the carcasses of failed projects. We were like vultures. We lived
She understood that English.
we lived off the carcasses of failed projects, and I had been involved in many, many construction claims where, you know, there were 12 lawyers in the room, and each of them had a claims consultant, and everything we were doing at that moment was adding no value to the one that really brought light to me was actually a college building. It was a chemistry lab building at UC Berkeley. And so it dawned on me after spending 25 years as a lawyer that despite my best efforts to negotiate really good contracts and to represent clients really well and successfully recover additional money for them at the end, that people lived with the fantasy that they were contracting away risk at the beginning of the job, when all it did was defer the reconciliation of the dollars to the end, and reconciling at the end meant the only ones who actually made money off of that process were the lawyers. The lawyers were the only ones. That deferred process, these people were just trying to claw back enough money so that their bosses wouldn't be upset with them. And the only ones that were really earning money were the lawyers. So I came to the recognition that this is not an effective way of managing risk, and that we need to come up with a contract model that recognizes the reality of what happens in the design and construction industry. So, and there are other lawyers in the United States who agreed, and there are other lawyers who, whenever we would begin, and Bill and I were actually talking about this morning, whenever we would begin with a new team to talk about signing an integrated form of agreement, we would tell the parties, we're going to send you the contract, but we will not accept any comments on it. What we want you to do is bring the people that will be involved in deciding how you're going to deliver the work, including your lawyers, your insurance agents, anybody else that's going to tell you you can't do this because, bring them to a full-day seminar that we're going to do about how we're going to work together differently, how we're going to behave differently, and then they can mark up the contract. Because they have to understand how different the way we're going to work together is to even begin to believe that the contract can reflect that. So that's a really long answer, and it really is. So you'll hear Bill and I regularly talk about this is transformational change. This is not, just moving. When you go to the contract, it's not just changing a little bit about the contract, it's actually rethinking what underlies the allocation of risk. Now, both of us will also agree you don't have to go to a three-party agreement to achieve much of the benefit that we've talked about. I've done it in both the private and public sector when I was still lawyering, where we would take an attachment and put it on the contract to talk about how we wanted to work together, and then still create a risk-reward pool so that people could have the shared profit, risk, and reward. But again, it has to be a fundamental difference in the way people are willing to think about how to allocate risk and reward with the people that we're doing this job with. So
I think all I would add to that really is if you go back to the image of the 20 large companies that I showed earlier, one of the things that they all agreed to was that they really own all the risk. The owner owns all the risk. What they want is partners to help mitigate risk in the appropriate manner. And some of our practices many of our traditional practices force risk upon people who are ill-equipped to deal with that risk. And so all it does is causes the consternation and the challenge and the litigation at the end of the programs, because we try to force those people into it. Disney very specifically tried that and ended up putting contractors out of business, because obviously they're much bigger and their lawyers are gorillas, right? So they can fight longer, and they would put contractors out of business in the greater Orlando, Florida area, to the point where they finally realized if we keep doing this, we're never going to have anyone build our projects, and we're going to not be able to grow and expand and improve. And so they finally looked in the mirror and said, we're our own worst enemy. And the same story with all 20 of those firms that are up on that chart had some similar story about that we need these people as partners. Let's talk about the risk in an open environment. Let's figure out how best to manage that. And some of that, if you watch that profit chart that I showed at the very end, part of that is we allow, if we can identify 5 significant risks on a project and we can somehow find a way to monetize that, we can do one of two things. When the risk brings itself to the fore, we can say, here's a bucket of money to fix that risk. Or we can say, hey, all of us in this room, we're all partners. who's got an idea about how to solve this risk problem? And it comes out of nowhere, who's got an idea, but all of that creativity is stifled in our traditional contracting models, because basically if you raise your hand, you own the solution, right? Whether you ever thought about it or not, that's just the way the industry behaves. And so everyone's sitting here like this, they're looking out the back window and they've got a great idea, even if it's not their specialty, or maybe sometimes it comes up as they claim it to be a dumb idea, right? But it's really not a dumb idea. And so then you get the people who can implement that idea and you figure out how to pay for it. And the goal then is to say, well, we thought this was going to cost 100, now we've solved it for 20, we get to save that money towards our profit. I mean, that's a real incentive for people now to raise their hand instead of the other way around.
And the only other thing I'll offer is we learned as we were getting ready for this week of seminars that Chile is what I would call a civil law jurisdiction, so there aren't codes that define a lot of things that a common law country like ours is defined. So it doesn't mean you're going to throw out 90% of the contract, because we didn't throw out 90% of the contract. 90% of what's in an IFOA, you still have, there's certain basic things you have to address. So even in Chile, there's going to be a big chunk of the law that is included in your contracts that you're not going to throw away. But it's really around these ideas of how are we going to behave, what methods are we going to use, and how are we going to allocate risk and reward. Those are the three big areas that if you, and so I'll give you an example. There's an organization in the United States that's called Consensus Docs, and they produce a set of standard agreements. The Consensus Doc 300 is a model version of the integrated form of agreement. They're associated with that. You can go onto their website and they have a guidebook, which is something we crafted when we worked with Consensus Doc to describe how you implement the contract. They also have what they call, I can look for you at the end, I think it's called the Consensus Doc 305. And what the 305 is it takes all the special things that are in the IFOA and it pulls them into one document, so that for somebody like Bill, if he has to have two separate contracts, you can attach that to each of the contracts and say, here's the special way that you're going to behave when you do this job. So it tries to unite the way people are doing it, even if they're not signing one contract. So there are ways to do it.
Thank you.
Parte de cosas que creo que compartir con ustedes. Sería bueno que anoten sus nombres y sus correos, porque les vamos a compartir alguna información que les puede ser útil. Para quienes vinieron acá, por ejemplo, han hablado de la lista de tipo, probablemente muchos de ustedes no saben qué es. Es el Integrated Agreement for Link Project Delivery, que es uno de los primeros contratos que se escribió, que lo desarrolló Will. Eso es una cosa que está disponible libremente, pero se lo podemos compartir si es que les interesa lo que hayan venido. Y lo mismo también algunos de los sitios que estaba mencionando Will, donde hay documentos. Harrison y yo hemos trabajado investigando estos temas por muchos años. También tenemos otros documentos que se pueden compartir. Así que, por favor, anótense para poder compartir esa información. Y lo otro es que si quieren preguntar en español, por favor háganlo y nosotros les ayudamos aquí intentando traducir.
Hello everyone, my name is Ricardo. I'm with Natalia. We work for Codelco, which is a mining business in Chile, and we actually work in lean as well, in lean management. And first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. And I do have a question, which is how did you relate the cost savings with the actual implementation? And I asking you this because we suffer a lot with this kind of things when we implement the problem-solving techniques that we have, because we normally hear from the clients or from the operation like, that wasn't because of your implementation, that was because I negotiate this or that, or the other thing that we normally hear is that is more workload. So just please let me keep my own way to do things and not to try this. So how did you actually, work with this?
Well, there's a lot to answer to that question. The first thing is, as I mentioned earlier, you're always going to have naysayers. Okay, so you have to be resilient along those lines. You know that you made an impact and you saved some money, whether others believe it or not. You got to keep chugging along. At some point, you're going to say, yeah, okay, the last 25 things I came to you with solutions that save money were all circumstantial, right? None of it was the work that we're doing. If you want to believe that, then go ahead. So you got to have a thick skin with that. The next thing is, part of what we try to accomplish with this partnering is entrepreneurial thinking or business partner thinking, right? And so before we would truly embark on an opportunity for savings in any sort of unique applications, we would say, okay, what does the current estimate carry for the costs to implement that piece of the work? So you have an estimate, and whatever the number is, you say, okay, this is how much we think this is going to cost. Now, let's take another approach and see how that works. And then we might do that for practice. We might do a couple of first piece proofs of that work or not, and judge it against that estimate. And in the way we manage costs, I don't know if there's really another more effective way to do that. I know a lot of the things in the mining industry are piecework or production-based driven. And so, if doing this work was 100 and you got it done for 90 and you can do that for 90, I mean, that's really, proof is in the pudding there. So we use, quite often, we didn't show it here, as an A3 methodology. So Google A3 thinking, if you're not sure what I mean by that. Okay, but to use that methodology, right, as sort of a concept and then a proof of concept methodology, and you can use that to document your outcomes and so forth. So part of it is naysayers, part of it is your entrepreneurial business approach to it, and then proof of concept over time, I think, is maybe the three suggestions I would make.
So I'm a constructor, so we're brothers. Okay? People have to want to believe. Customers have to want to believe rather than doubt. And what I mean by that is metrics actually don't convince. You're basically demonstrating that metrics don't convince somebody who's not open to being convinced. And I'll give you an example of the flip side of the conversation. So we have a major industrial customer that we've been working with for 5 years towards using an integrated form of agreement, and we were actually getting ready to use it on a $400 million project. And at the last minute, their senior people said, this all sounds good, but we don't want to take the productivity risk that the contractor won't be able to achieve the productivity that's represented in the estimate, because on all of our projects, we run at a 0.85. We never hit 1.0 in terms of our earned value management. Our contractors are never able to hit the numbers. And what we said to them is, the reason your contractors are never able to hit their numbers is because of the way you manage your work. And we will demonstrate to you on this job that we can, by working together differently, produce significantly different results in terms of productivity. And they said, okay, show us. Now they have a very extensive way of validating and benchmarking our estimates, and estimates down at the level of the hour